Let's look at two iconic World War II British Empire fighting knives, the Gurkha Kukri and the Fairbairn Sykes Commando Dagger. Which of these has the advantage in a straight-up knife fight? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and the first thing we have to say is these aren't equals in any way. They are different tools designed for different jobs, being carried by different types of soldiers. So in many ways, this is a completely unfair comparison, but nevertheless, I think there's some really interesting points to be raised in making such a comparison. And it's not an impossible scenario to imagine one person with a knife of these sorts of characteristics coming up against a person with a knife of these sorts of characteristics. We also have to state, of course, that these have different virtues in terms of being used as a tool or anything like that, but we're not looking at that here. We're purely looking at them as fighting knives. And equally, in any type of combat, be it boxing, wrestling, or armed combat, a lot of it is going to come down to the individuals, their strengths, their weaknesses, their physical shape and fitness, all of those kinds of things, and what they're used to using. So two combatants, one might have an advantage with one weapon, one might have an advantage with another weapon. But all things being equal, what are the strengths and weaknesses in a straight up fight between the Kukri and the Fairbairn Sykes Commando Dagger? But super quickly, before we delve into those points, I want to have a quick word from my sponsors for this video, who are Raid Shadow Legends. And I've been playing Raid for a couple of years and been doing promotions for it on this channel. And I want to show you some different features to Raid and a slightly different perspective for why I love it as a game. If you haven't tried playing it, why not? This is genuinely the only game that I play regularly on my mobile phone. It's free to play, free to download. One of the best things about Raid is the awesome graphics, the weapons, the armor, the equipment. They are beautifully, beautifully rendered. They're actually really well researched. I mean, look at that. Where is it? There we go, mace. It's a beautifully rendered 16th century style flanged mace. The other amazing thing about Raid is you've got a bunch of different ways you can play. So this is your main town square where you can level up your champion. You've got the campaign, which is really, really cool. Got a really cool story to it. You've got dungeons where you can try and get better times, win money, win prizes, level up your characters that way. You've got the arena, which, as you guys probably know, is my absolute favorite. This month's Raid's got a bunch of new features, including a brand new dungeon, an artifact ascension, battle through the Sand Devil's Necropolis, and that precious oil needed to take your artifacts to the next level. There are a bunch of new champions being added, including some holiday special ones to get you into the festive spirit, and the bastions even being given some festive decorations as well. But the really massive news is the brand new legendary champion, Ronda, based on MMA legend Ronda Rousey. Yes, the Ronda Rousey. You can get Ronda in your game right now. And this is for both new and existing players. All you've got to do is log into Raid and play between now and February the 20th, and Ronda's going to be there for you for free. To celebrate Ronda's arrival in Raid, you can use the special promo code RAIDRONDA, and that's not just for new users, that's for all users. That'll get you a sweet package of a 3-day 100% XP boost, 500k silver, and 5 full energy refills, which is perfect for leveling up your Ronda so she's at the top of her game. Also, if you're an Amazon Prime member, then you can get exclusive rewards in Raid right now. If you're a new player and you haven't started playing yet, then if you use my link right below or scan the QR code on screen, then you'll get bonuses worth $30 straight away. We're talking about a free epic champion, Aina, 200k silver, 1 energy refill, and 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so that you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get into game. And if you are new and you do that, then the treasure will be all waiting for you up here in the inbox, and remember that's only for new players and only for the next 30 days. And you can find me in game under the name Captain Context, and if you're quick enough, you can join my clan. Right, so now let's get back to these main points. So as mentioned, these are clearly very different objects, and yet they were carried in the same theatres, both in North Africa and Europe and the Middle East and the Far East in the same period. So they're both World War II fighting knives. And of course the Kukri goes back way beyond that. The Kukri goes back really to probably about the 16th century. The origins of the Kukri are somewhat obscure. But this one here is probably a World War II, it might even be pre-World War II example. Various models of Kukri were being carried and not just, as some people think, by the Gurkhas, the Nepalese soldiers who were part of the British and Indian armies at that time, but these were also carried by other British Empire troops. My own great uncle, Uncle John, he fought in Burma throughout the Second World War, and his family have still got his kukri. He was in the Royal Engineers, and a lot of the soldiers working for him and serving under him were Indian and Gurkha. So British soldiers sometimes had these. These were always also used by some people in the trenches of World War I as well, incidentally. Both Indian and Nepalese soldiers, but also British soldiers as well. And these were carried by British, Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, and in some cases Americans in World War II. So these were things which were sometimes issued, sometimes privately purchased, and carried by all sorts of people. They're a very, very popular tool, and it has to be said, predominantly used as a tool rather than a weapon, and that is an important point which is worth acknowledging here. In contrast, the Fairbairn Sykes Commando Dagger is a very, very specialised thing. However, what a lot of you might not realise is this was also carried by vast numbers of people in World War II. So not only was this, obviously this was originally designed for special forces, as we now call them, by Fairbairn and Sykes. I've done some previous videos on this, and I will do future videos delving more deeply into the Fairbairn Sykes dagger, its use and its evolution. However, in the Second World War, whilst these were most famously carried by commandos, and they are still the emblem of the commandos, Royal Marines, paratroopers, all sorts, these were actually carried by all sorts of other British soldiers. So these were made in huge numbers, particularly this is an original late Second World War third pattern. The third pattern in particular was made in huge numbers, and all sorts of British troops carried them as a backup implement should they need it. But additionally, they were also given out to the Home Guard, which, Dad's Army, which a lot of people don't know. They were also given to RAF crews on bombers and things like this, Royal Navy, all sorts. So actually, although this is seen as a commando dagger and kind of used in covert, stealthy commando missions, which is the kind of glamorous idea of how these were used, in fact, these were carried by basically loads of people in British, Indian, and other British Empire, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African forces as well. So carried by a huge number of people. So obviously these were both on the Allied side. There are, as far as I'm aware, very, very few or almost no documented examples of Axis forces, German, Austrian, Italian, whatever, carrying either of these. However, I still think it's interesting, weapon versus weapon, to match these up. How do they measure up in an actual fight? So the very first point I want to contrast between these two is a very important one, and that is reach. Okay, now anyone who does any form of armed martial arts, whether it's fencing or whether it's Filipino knife stuff or whatever, you will know that reach makes a huge difference. If you have got a longer reach of your stick or knife or sword or spear or whatever weapon you're using, it means that you can hit the opponent before they can hit you. Now in a knife fight, this is actually relatively important depending on where you start and how the knife fight evolves. So obviously if you both pull your knives when you're already at wrestling distance, it makes almost no difference at all. However, if you pull knives out of wrestling distance, out of engagement distance, which, can happen, then in that situation, the weapon with the longer reach, the reason that the reach is so important is because, as we've looked at in previous videos, when you're attacking, the thing which is most vulnerable is the hand and arm. Okay, so if an attack comes in at you, it could be a stab in point up, point down, it could be that way, it could be point up, in whatever, or it could be a chop. In whatever way, the person has to extend their arm and their hand in order to get you. And in that time, if you're a trained knife fighter, you can move off the line or away, and in the same time hit or stab, in some cases, their incoming arm or hand. Okay, now, the bigger your blade, the easier it is to do that. Moreover, if we simply attack each other, the longer weapon will reach the opponent before their weapon can reach you. Okay, so reach is super important in two ways. One, because of literal reach, how far you can reach away from your body to hit someone with it, be with a stab or a cut. or indeed the engagement region, shall we say, of your blade. So if there's an incoming stab or cut or anything at me, then if I'm going to lay into the person's incoming hand or arm with my weapon, having 12 inches of blade makes that a lot easier than only having 6.5 or 7 inches of blade, okay, because you've got a lot more to work with. So quite simply, reach is super important in armed martial arts. And so therefore, in a knife fight, weapon against weapon, the person with the kukri is always going to slightly be able to outreach the person with the shorter knife, because they'll be hitting the other person's hand before this person is able to hit this hand. And indeed, if they were reaching for the body, that would still be the case. It would still be easier to reach the person's arm while moving out of distance from being stabbed in the body. So, weapon against weapon, in a straight up knife fight, the kukri obviously has a big reach advantage. But flipping that on its head, if we're in a, what some people call a FUT, F-U-T, a tangle, you can imagine what the first word is, then if we're in a wrestling, rolling around on the ground, we're in a confined space, in a room, in a carriage, in a, I don't know, a cockpit, anything, any kind of confined space, simply even in a trench, or simply, we could be in an open space, but we've slammed together and that's the point at which we pull the weapons out. At that distance, all of the rules I've just mentioned kind of flip on their head, because now the kukri has to be swung, usually, to be effective, and it is bigger and more unwieldy and easier to oppose and grab and divert and things like this. The smaller Fairbairn Sykes, on the other hand, is much easier to deploy, get into different places, get in from different angles at point blank range. So, if we're essentially at what I'll call boxing or even really wrestling distance, grappling distance, at that distance I would argue that the Fairbairn Sykes now has the reach advantage, because conversely it's shorter and therefore more wieldable, more manoeuvrable in that particular distance and situation. Now we're going to isolate some specific features here, and first up is cutting. Well, I'm not going to belabor this point very much, because it should be fairly obvious to most people watching that this, for the most part, is a more effective cutting implement than this. And yes, indeed, you could say to me, but this small 7-inch blade, or slightly under 7-inch blade, could, you know, sever an artery in the neck, as Fairbairn shows in his manual, or the brachial artery in the arm, or in a thigh, or wherever, okay? Yes, indeed, this could be used to cut something that will kill a person in seconds due to blood loss. Not to say this isn't a dangerous thing with a cut. This can be dangerous with a cut if applied to the right place at the right time. But by and large, this can also do all of those same cuts, much like a smatchet, which was also a weapon which Fairbairn was a big fan of, and in many ways actually we could compare this with the smatchet. But the kukri can do all of those types of cuts that the Fairbairn Sykes dagger can do, and a lot more as well. And it can chop. It can chop into bits of body that the Fairbairn Sykes really can't. It can chop through clothing, and we'll come into the issue of clothing and equipment in a little bit of a minute. So this really is a more powerful chopper. It's going to chop deeper, and it has more chopping and cutting and slashing options available to it than the Fairbairn Sykes does. But when it comes to stabbing or thrusting, use of the point, well, the tables are completely turned here, because very clearly this is a dagger very specialised towards stabbing and thrusting. Not to say it can't cut, as I've said, there are things you can do with the edges of this blade, and we know that Fairbairn did it because it's described in his manuals, in his books, and it's also shown in the videos which thankfully have survived of him in action with a knife. So we know that Fairbairn did slash and did chop and cut with this blade, despite the fact it doesn't really look that it's particularly specialised for that, but it is primarily a stabbing blade. Some people refer to this as a stiletto, even in period, and I'm not really a big fan of the word stiletto for this, because I'm rather acquainted with 17th century stilettos, and I would not really describe this as a stiletto. I would describe this as a dagger, and a dagger is a type of knife. So it is a knife. It was known as the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, etched on the blade in period, but it is a dagger, which is a type of knife. Would I call it a stiletto? Personally, no. But I can see why people call them that, because they are quite specialised towards stabbing and thrusting. Now, the Kukri, in contrast, is quite bad at stabbing for a number of reasons. I will just very briefly outline the reasons. Firstly, the cross-section of the blade is very fat, very thick. The shape, the silhouette of the blade is also rather leaf-like and fat. Now, if you do get it into a target, it will make a large wound, but it has a large blunt back on here, which will mean that you will encounter quite a lot of resistance of trying to get that through clothing. Again, we'll come back to the clothing point in a second. But overall, this is not a great thrusting shaped point. Also, it is not really in line with the direction of the handle. The handle direction, as you'll see, points out here, which means that whenever you encounter resistance, the weapon will have a tendency to want to kick out at the back. It's not in a straight line, so straight lines are the best way of delivering energy into a target. And finally, the shape of the grip. Now, we don't have any form of crossguard on a traditional kukri. There are some which have crossguards, modern ones and also some traditional ones, but by and large, the really traditional kukri doesn't have any form of guard on it. And therefore, it's completely smooth here, which means that if you do deliver a stab into a target, which you can do, and it's best advised to go for the face, I would say, but if you come into the body, for example, and meet a lot of resistance, the hand has a tendency of wanting to ride up, which could be very dangerous for your hand, and of course will equally mean you'll lose energy and you won't get through the target you're trying to stab. There is only one mitigating thing here, and that is that rib around the grip of the kukri, and that does lock into the hand and prevent it moving up or down very much. So that's presumably why it's there. It's to keep your hand secure on the grip without the need for a guard. But nevertheless, this weapon is not really set up for very good stabbing or thrusting, and even if you do get into a target, it's not going to go very deep, possibly, depending where it lands, not deep enough to do any serious damage. Whereas this blade certainly will. Once it's entered the target, it will relatively easily enter all the way up to the hilt, so you will get 6 or 7 inches deep in a target. Even if you only go 3 inches deep in a target, that's more than enough to get to a lot of the arteries you're going to be aiming for. But if you push the whole blade in, it will reach all sorts of internal organs as well. So this is absolutely better suited to stabbing, kind of obvious, than the kukri is. So the next point I wanted to add is defense, okay? And I think that's oftentimes when people are collectors of or aficionados of fighting knives, they don't always necessarily think about the defensive arts for preventing yourself from being stabbed. On the most fundamental level, if you have 2 people with knives and you stab them, there's nothing to stop them stabbing you unless you put some sort of defense in. That could be via distance, it could be via geometry, placement, line, it could be the use of your left hand, it could be because you're wrestling and grappling and you've managed to get them into a position where they're locked up and you can push your blade in. There's many, many different ways you can achieve it. Now, therefore, it's quite a complicated topic to address in a concise way, but concisely speaking, overall, I would say that the Fairbairn Sykes has fewer defensive options available to it compared to the larger bladed kukri, simply because of size. Because this blade is bigger, it means that you can interpose with it, quite literally sort of countercut or parry into incoming things. Even if someone, for example, runs a bayonet at you, so if someone comes charging at you with a bayonet on the end of a rifle, you can knock the thing aside, smash it downwards, parry, essentially, with this, because it's like a little sword. Okay, there are some swords which aren't much bigger than this. It's a bit like a falcata from the ancient period. So there are things you can do with the blade of this that you maybe might be able to pull off with the Fairbairn Sykes, but it's a very small blade to be able to do that. Yes, you might be able to push a bayonet blade off, and admittedly there are other ways you can do it. You can use your left hand, you can move out of the way, all of these kinds of things, but you can also do those other things with the kukri. So I'd say pound for pound, measure for measure, whilst a lot of the defensive, wrestling, grappling, parrying with other bits of your body, all of those things you can do with either knife, there are things you can do with the kukri due to the size of the blade that you can't easily or reliably do with the Fairbairn Sykes. So in terms of defence, I personally would consider the Kukri much stronger in defence than the Fairbairn Sykes dagger. However, defence has a whole nother element to it, and if we bring this into real world applications, it doesn't matter whether you're a soldier serving in the jungles of Burma in 1944 or 43, whether you're a modern civilian, it doesn't matter if you're like hiking through the Himalayas or anything like that. If you are attacked, the likelihood is, or if you need to access your weapon, the likelihood is that both of these are going to be somewhere on your body being worn, not in your hand. Because whether it's a Kukri, unless you happen to be cutting through jungle, I suppose, but whether it's a Kukri or a Fairbairn Sykes dagger, both of these will be deposited somewhere in your body, which hopefully your brain knows where it is and you have practiced accessing your weapon from that point. And in that split second, your defence and your reliability of defence, it doesn't matter whether it's a screaming Japanese soldier with a bayonet or whether it's a really angry shepherd in Nepal, someone who comes and attacks you, you're going to need to get your weapon out quickly. Now, obviously, or at least some people here will be familiar with accessing weapons in a firearms context. And you can have a massive, great Dirty Harry revolver, but if you have trouble pulling it out quickly, getting the muzzle on line with the opponent and actually firing it quickly, then someone with a smaller 38 snub nose is going to have the advantage because they're getting their gun out quicker. Okay, so just the same with knives. The longer the blade is, the longer it takes to get out of the sheath or scabbard. Additionally, I have to be honest, I personally find Kukri scabbards somewhat slow to access weapons quickly out of. In contrast, the Fairbairn Sykes isn't actually fantastic in that they often have a piece of elastic around the pommel and it's not particularly quick to get that off. That being said, there are other options. There are press stud options, particularly on the earlier scabbards. So depending on the scabbard arrangement, and again, there's different options for Kukris as well. Some of them have a bigger throat or bigger opening for the knife than others. But generally speaking, although there's small parameters that are different here between given scabbard types, I would say that it's quicker and easier to access the Fairbairn Sykes than the Kukri. And again, it depends where you wear it, if it's concealed, all of that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, I would say on average, caveats aside, I would say that the Kukri is more unwieldy and more difficult to get out quickly when suddenly attacked than the Fairbairn Sykes. And we also have to bear in mind as well, I mean, these were issued to SOE, spies and various people in civilian French resistance, for example, and these were often secreted inside jackets and stuffed in the top of trousers underneath the shirt and this kind of stuff. These were often hidden, in which case they wouldn't necessarily be quick to access, but they were nevertheless designed to be something that could be secreted anywhere on you or your equipment, and were designed to be quick access things to be used in a pinch, sometimes at very close grappling distance. So these, by their very nature, should be quicker and easier to deploy in a pinch than a Kukri is. Okay, now I promised I'd get to the point of clothing and equipment, and this is a very interesting point. Now, bearing in mind everything I've said so far about the fact that this is a formidable chopper but not a very good stabber, this is not a very good cutter except at exposed parts, but it is a very good stabber. Now, if we put this into a World War II context at least, then most of the people who might be engaged in a knife fight might be wearing military uniform and webbing and other military equipment. Now, in that scenario, we could sort of discuss the combatants as being lightly armoured. And now you might think that's going a little bit far, but if we assume that both people have got helmets on, which soldiers practically always did do, so they're going to have a form of steel helmet usually, and they're going to have uniforms which involve multiple layers, usually of wool-based clothing, which is not the easiest to cut or stab through. And in addition, they might have backpacks, they might have cross belts or any other kind of webbing or Sam Browne belts, this kind of stuff. So, given that, we might be dealing with multiple layers of fabric, we might be dealing with winter clothing which has padding, and we might be dealing with leather and or canvas straps. So actually, and a steel helmet on top of the head. So actually there's quite a lot there to contend with. Now, the smatchet or the Kukri, we know absolutely was used effectively for chopping in this scenario. World War I, World War II. But they were aimed at specific targets, and there's some bits of the body where you won't necessarily get through what's in front of you. So very often these will be used at the side of the neck, side of the head, the face, the top of the forearms, this kind of the thigh, this kind of places. So places which are going to have less covering on them and more exposed, but you're going to be cutting into the target, doing huge arterial and sometimes skeletal damage. The Fairbairn Sykes, on the other hand, whilst in the manuals it is shown where to cut and where to stab to achieve the quickest death rate, you could basically stick this through anything I've just mentioned. And that is one of the advantages of stab over cut, is yes, a cut can be immediately incapacitating. You can lop someone's hand off, or potentially even head. Whereas a stab, whilst it might kill you in 10 or 30 or 40, 50 seconds time, so it might be more fatal, it might take time to actually incapacitate the opponent, depending where it goes. So in that sense, balancing that, but this will go through anything. So basically any of the clothing that we've described. So winter clothing, it might be difficult to chop or cut through winter clothing. And we find this mentioned in reference to cavalry swords going all the way back to the Napoleonic period, where people in winter clothing got chopped about with sabres and were basically uninjured. So sometimes it can be more difficult to chop through this stuff than to stab through it, because the stab is concentrated on a small point and thrusts will go through things that cuts won't. So weighing the two things up, again, it's the question of cut versus stab, but the equipment and the clothing, I think if you're talking about heavy winter clothing, that would give the advantage to the stabber. If you're talking about Pacific War in the jungle clothing, we might have more of an advantage for the kukri. So it's contextual, I would say, in this case, as to which has the advantage. And it's a cut versus stab debate that goes all the way back for centuries in time in reference to swords and dueling and battlefield use of swords as well. Right, so I've covered most of the points about a knife fight, a straight up knife fight, which is what I wanted to focus on in this particular video. I just want to give an honourable mention to stealth. Now, a lot of people have argued that the Fairbairn Sykes is made as a stealth dagger, essentially as an assassin's dagger. Now, I wouldn't fully agree with that. This was clearly designed as a general purpose fighting knife. And in fact, if we go back to World War I, and we look at trench knives that were developed both formally and issued, for example, the Austro-Hungarian one, or the Austrian one, or indeed unofficial ones that people just purchased from shops to use in the trenches, actually a lot of them look like this. So a lot of trench knives are not very different to this. And equally, if we look at a lot of fighting knives throughout history, just general purpose fighting knives, they're not that different to this. This has some unique features, which I'll look at in a future video. But nevertheless, they're not hugely different to this. So I don't agree that this is completely an assassin stealth special forces knife only. It can be more things than that. But it has to be said that in a stealthy situation where you're creeping up on a sentry, for example, and you're going to try and cover their mouth with your hand, pull their neck to the side and stab them and finish them quickly, as is shown in Fairbairn's manual, then this is much better suited for it than this is, because if you snuck up on a sentry, say from behind or the side, at night, and your aim is to kill that sentry quickly and silently without alerting anyone else, I would argue that the best way to do it, first of all, you've got to cover the mouth, is to come up silently behind them, grab here, pull their head to the side, and then straight down there, as shown in the manual. Whereas, how are you going to do something equivalent to that with a kukri? Yes, you could sneak up behind the person and give them a big smack in the back of the neck, and that might do the job, because it might half sever their neck, and they're not going to make any sound. They're going to crumple to the ground. But it's a little less controllable, I would say. It's a little bit more vulnerable to random things going wrong, his helmet clattering across the ground, or the cut fouling on a collar and not cutting through, and him going, ah, as you then kill him again with more blows from the kukri. So I think this is more a weapon of kind of melee, battlefield war going crazy. And in that sense, this is better suited to killing silently, which, as we know, was a big part of what Special Forces and SOE sometimes focused on doing. So to conclude, and bear in mind this is a straight up knife fight between two equal individuals, and also bearing in mind we're not looking here at which is better as a tool, because clearly the kukri is better for most of the time as a tool. Fairbairn Sykes dagger is just a fighting knife, it is not even remotely a tool, and so they are different things for different jobs, carried for the most part by different types of soldier. Although I want to do a tiny bit of myth busting and remind you that it wasn't only the Gurkhas that carried kukris, other people carried them as well, and it wasn't only the commandos that carried the Fairbairn Sykes, lots of other people carried those as well. So, and sometimes you could have within one group of people, you might have 3 people over there with a kukri and 3 people over there with Fairbairn Sykes. So they were both carried in the same theatre by the same sorts of people some of the time. But in a straight up knife fight, what's my conclusion? Well, assuming we're starting out of distance, and we've both got our knives already deployed and in our hands, and we're facing each other from 10 feet away, at that point, who do I put my money on? I put my money on the kukri, okay? Probably every time, if I think that the individuals are evenly matched and experienced and sized and skilled and all those other things. So my money goes on the kukri in that engagement. If the fight starts at grappling distance, then my money is on the Fairbairn Sykes. So basically, it's a bit of a cop-out answer. I think that in a knife fight, it's situational. What are the people wearing? What distance are they starting at? These types of things. And those are I think those are the 2 principal things in my mind. What are they wearing? And what distance does the fight start at? If the fight distance is very, very close, I give it to the Fairbairn Sykes. If they're starting at kind of dueling distance, then I give it to the kukri. But they are both absolutely awesome and fantastic fighting knives of World War II. And I'm very honoured to own both of these in my collection, and I love both of them. And if I had to give one away, I don't know which one I'd give away. Probably I'd give the kukri away because I've got lots more kukris, and at the moment I only have one World War II FS dagger. But that aside, I love them both. They're both fantastic tools that clearly played an incredibly important part, if not materially, then morally and in people's mindset, propaganda and everything else in World War II. Very important knives, fighting knives, really of history now, not just of World War II, but of all history. I hope this has been enjoyable, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel again soon. Cheers for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.